The Wyoming winter of 1885 hit harder than anyone could remember. Snow piled up against the fences like white mountains, and the wind howled through the valley with a voice that seemed to carry warnings from another world. Jacob Morrison stood on his porch, watching the storm clouds gather over his ranch, and wondered how much longer he could keep going. His wife had passed 3 years ago, leaving him alone with 1,000 acres of land, 200 head of cattle, and a heart that had forgotten how to feel anything but the dull ache of loneliness. He was 42 years old, but he felt ancient, worn down by the relentless cycle of seasons and the endless work that came with running a ranch by himself. His nearest neighbor, Richard Sterling, lived 5 miles down the valley in a grand house that spoke of old money and Eastern refinement. Sterling had brought a Chinese cook all the way from San Francisco, a woman named Mei Lin who was supposed to transform his household with exotic dishes and oriental efficiency. But within 2 weeks, Sterling had fired her. The story spread through the small ranching community like wildfire. Sterling claimed she was insolent, that she refused to cook proper American food, that she had strange habits and couldn't follow simple instructions. He told everyone who would listen that hiring a Chinese woman had been a terrible mistake, and he warned others not to make the same error. Jacob heard the story at the general store in town, where men gathered around the pot-bellied stove to escape the cold and share gossip. He didn't say anything, but something about Sterling's complaints didn't sit right with him. He had met Sterling's wife once, a pinched woman with a permanent expression of displeasure, and he had watched how Sterling treated his ranch hands with contempt and cruelty. Jacob suspected that the problem might not have been with the cook at all. 2 days later, as he was hauling water from the well to his livestock, he saw a figure trudging through the snow along the road that passed his property. At first, he thought it might be a lost traveler, but as the figure came closer, he realized it was a small woman carrying a bundle on her back. She was dressed inadequately for the weather, with only a thin coat and a scarf wrapped around her head. She walked with determination despite the cold, placing one foot in front of the other with the persistence of someone who had no choice but to keep moving forward. Jacob set down his buckets and walked to the edge of his property. When the woman came close enough, he called out to her. She stopped and looked at him with dark eyes that showed both wariness and exhaustion. He recognized her then as the cook from Sterling's place. Her face was delicate but weathered, with high cheekbones and a mouth set in a line that suggested she had learned not to expect kindness from the world. "You're walking to town?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the storm was coming in fast. She nodded. "I find work there," she said in careful English, each word pronounced with concentration. "You won't make it before the storm hits," Jacob said, looking at the darkening sky. "That's a bad one coming. You'll freeze to death out here." Mei Lin looked at the horizon and then back at him. "I must try," she said simply. Jacob made a decision that surprised himself. "I need a cook," he said abruptly. "My food tastes like leather, and I'm tired of eating the same thing every day. If you're looking for work, you can work here. I've got a spare room in the bunkhouse. It's warm and dry." She studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if this was another trap, another household where she would be mistreated and then discarded. "Mr. Sterling said bad things about me," she said. "You heard them." "I heard them," Jacob acknowledged. "I also know Richard Sterling is a pompous fool who treats people like property. I'm not him. I'm fair, and I pay what I owe. I need help, and you need a place. That's all there is to it." The snow began to fall more heavily, large flakes that settled on Mei Lin's dark hair like small stars. She looked at the road ahead, then back at Jacob's ranch house with its curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Finally, she nodded. "I will try," she said. "But if you are not good man, I will leave." "Fair enough," Jacob said. "Come on then, before we both freeze." He led her to the ranch house, carrying her bundle for her despite her protests. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, with furniture that was functional rather than decorative. The kitchen was large, built for a family that no longer existed, with a massive cast-iron stove that dominated one wall. Mei Lin set down her things and looked around with an expression that Jacob couldn't quite read. "I will cook dinner," she said. "You will see what I can do." Jacob nodded and left her to it, going back to his chores. He didn't expect much. He figured she would make something with rice and vegetables, something foreign that he probably wouldn't like but would eat out of politeness. He was used to disappointment. 2 hours later, when he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, the house smelled like nothing he had ever experienced before. There were layers to the aroma, spices he couldn't name, something rich and savory that made his stomach growl with sudden hunger. The table was set simply, and Mei Lin was standing by the stove, watching a wok that she must have brought in her bundle. Steam rose from it in clouds, and the sound of sizzling filled the room. She served him a bowl of rice topped with vegetables and beef that had been cut into perfect strips and cooked in a sauce that gleamed like dark amber. There were other dishes too, small portions of things he had never seen before. He picked up his fork, then noticed that she had set out 2 thin wooden sticks beside his plate. "Chopsticks," she said, seeing his confusion. "But fork is okay too." Jacob used his fork and took a bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth, complex and layered in ways that he had never imagined food could be. There was heat and sweetness, salt and something else he couldn't identify, all working together in perfect harmony. He took another bite, then another, eating with a focus that surprised him. It had been 3 years since food had been anything more than fuel, but this was different. This was something that made him remember what pleasure felt like. "This is remarkable," he said when he finally paused. "I've never tasted anything like it." Mei Lin allowed herself a small smile. "This is what I tried to cook for Mr. Sterling," she said. "He said it was foreign trash. He said I should make him roast beef and potatoes like civilized people eat." Jacob shook his head. "Then he's a bigger fool than I thought." Over the following weeks, a routine developed between them. Jacob worked the ranch, rising before dawn to tend to his cattle and horses, mending fences, hauling hay, doing the 1,000 tasks that winter demanded. Mei Lin transformed his kitchen into something magical. She cooked dishes that changed with each day, using ingredients from his larder in ways he had never imagined. She made soups that warmed him from the inside out, stir-fries that burst with flavor, dumplings that she folded with swift, practiced movements. She was efficient and quiet, moving through the house like a ghost, leaving everything cleaner and more organized than it had been before. But there was more to it than just the cooking. Mei Lin had a way of seeing things that Jacob had stopped noticing. She looked at his broken gate and mentioned quietly that it needed fixing before the cattle pushed through. She noticed when he was limping slightly from an old injury and left a poultice by his door without saying a word. She began to plant seeds in small pots near the kitchen window, preparing for a spring garden that would bring fresh vegetables to his table. Jacob found himself talking to her in the evenings, something he hadn't done with another person in years. At first, their conversations were simple, limited by her careful English and his complete lack of Chinese. But gradually, they found a way to communicate that went beyond words. She told him about her life in China, about the village where she had grown up and the circumstances that had brought her to America. She had come seeking a better life, but had found mostly prejudice and hardship. She had worked in restaurants and private homes, always treated as less than human, always aware that she was unwelcome. Jacob told her about his wife, Sarah, and how her death had left him hollowed out. He talked about the ranch and how it had been his father's dream, passed down to him along with the weight of expectation. He admitted that he had been thinking about selling it, about giving up and moving to the city where he could disappear into anonymity. But something about having Mei Lin there, about coming home to a warm house and good food and the presence of another human being, had changed things. He felt less like a ghost drifting through the motions of life and more like a person again. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, reluctant and tentative. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Mei Lin planted her garden, working in the soil with a concentration that suggested it was something sacred. Jacob helped her, following her instructions about spacing and depth. They worked side by side in companionable silence, and Jacob realized that he was content in a way he hadn't been in years. The transformation of the ranch became apparent to others. When neighbors stopped by, they noticed the improvements. The house looked cared for, with curtains in the windows and flowers beginning to bloom in beds that had been barren for years. Jacob himself looked different, healthier and more alive. Men who had written him off as a lost cause started treating him with new respect. Richard Sterling heard about it, of course. In a small community, nothing stayed secret for long. He rode over one afternoon, his face red with indignation, and demanded to see Jacob. When Jacob came out of the barn, Sterling didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I heard you hired that Chinese woman," Sterling said accusingly. "After I specifically warned everyone about her." "I did," Jacob said calmly. "She's the best cook I've ever had, and she works harder than anyone I've ever known." "She's insolent and she doesn't know her place," Sterling insisted. "She refused to do things the proper way. She tried to force her foreign ways on decent Americans." Jacob looked at Sterling for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "She tried to do her job well, and you were too ignorant to recognize quality when you had it. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Sterling sputtered with rage, but Jacob turned and walked away. It was the first time he had stood up to Sterling, the first time he had chosen principle over the easy path of going along. It felt good. But the confrontation had consequences. Sterling began spreading new rumors, darker ones. He suggested that Jacob's relationship with Mei Lin was improper, that a white man living alone with a Chinese woman could only mean one thing. The gossip grew uglier, fed by prejudice and ignorance. Some of the neighboring ranchers began to distance themselves from Jacob. He was invited to fewer gatherings, greeted with coldness in town. Jacob was prepared to weather it, but Mei Lin was not. She came to him one evening and told him she had to leave. "I bring you trouble," she said, her voice steady but her eyes showing pain. "People talk. They will make your life difficult. I should go." "No," Jacob said firmly. "I won't let ignorant gossip drive you away. You've done nothing wrong. We've done nothing wrong." "It doesn't matter what is true," Mei Lin said with the weariness of someone who had learned this lesson many times. "It matters what people believe." Jacob sat down heavily. She was right, he knew. In this time and place, appearances mattered more than reality. The unfairness of it burned in his chest. Then, looking at her across the table, seeing the strength and dignity in her bearing despite everything she had endured, he made another decision that surprised himself. "Then we'll give them something real to talk about," he said. "Mei Lin, would you consider marrying me?" She stared at him in shock. "You don't mean that," she said. "You say it because you feel sorry for me." "No," Jacob said, standing and walking around the table to face her. "I say it because over these past months, you've brought my life back to me. You've made this house a home again. You've made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you partnership, if you'll have it." Mei Lin's eyes filled with tears. "Your neighbors will hate this," she said. "They will treat you worse than they treat me." "Let them," Jacob said. "I've spent 3 years being dead inside. I'd rather be alive and scorned than safe and empty." They were married in town by a justice of the peace who clearly disapproved but couldn't find a legal reason to refuse them. There were no guests, no celebration. Richard Sterling tried to organize opposition, even speaking to the territorial governor about the scandal of interracial marriage, but the law was on their side. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, facing an uncertain future together. The years that followed were not easy. Some neighbors never accepted them. They faced prejudice and occasional threats. But they also found unexpected allies, people who judged them by their character rather than by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their marriage. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Mei Lin's garden became legendary, producing vegetables that she sold in town. She began teaching other ranch wives about Chinese cooking, slowly breaking down barriers through the universal language of good food. Jacob and Mei Lin had 3 children, each one a bridge between 2 cultures, each one living proof that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose. They raised their children to be proud of both their heritages, to stand firm against prejudice, to judge people by their actions rather than their appearances. Years later, when Jacob was an old man sitting on his porch, watching his grandchildren play in the yard, he thought about that winter day when he had seen a small figure trudging through the snow. He thought about how close he had come to letting her pass by, to missing the chance that would transform his life. Mei Lin sat beside him, her hair now streaked with gray, her hands weathered by years of work. She was still beautiful to him, still the person who had saved him from his slow death of loneliness and despair. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "About how one decision can change everything," he said. "About how the best thing I ever did was ignore Richard Sterling's warnings and trust my own judgment." Mei Lin smiled and took his hand. "The best thing I ever did was trust a stranger who offered me kindness when I needed it most," she said. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. Two people who had found each other across impossible distances and against impossible odds, who had built a life together on foundations of respect, partnership, and love. The ranch that Jacob had once thought of abandoning had become a legacy, a place where their children and grandchildren would learn that courage and compassion mattered more than prejudice, that human connection could overcome any barrier. And it had all started with a simple act of decency on a cold winter day, when a lonely rancher decided to judge a woman by her character rather than by what others said about her. That decision, made in a moment of instinct and basic human kindness, had changed two lives forever, creating ripples that would extend far beyond anything either of them could have imagined. In a world that often seemed determined to divide people, they had found a way to build a bridge, one meal, one day, one act of love at a time.